and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. Special Representative for North Korea Steve Biegun reminded the North Koreans that Christmas is a sacred holiday and that North Korea should drop its hostile rhetoric and return to the talks. Mr. Biegun's comments follow North Korea's second crucial test at a satellite launch facility. What Christmas gift will Pyongyang send? And what will be Washington's response?
I'd be disappointed if something would be in the works, and if it is, we'll take care of it, but we'll see.
Let me speak directly to our counterparts in North Korea. It is time for us to do our jobs. Let's get this done.
In the studio with me today, Ambassador Mark Lippert, U.S. Ambassador to South Korea from 2014 to 2017. Also joining me, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. His latest book, South Korea at the Crossroads, charts the evolution of South Korean foreign policy and strategic choices. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Ambassador, North Korea ignored Special Representative Biegun's calls for a meeting. Do you think North Korea is now determined to go for a major provocation before its own set artificial year-end deadline?
Well, I think your question's a good one. And first of all, I should say thanks. It's great to be here. And question's a good one in that it does look like the North is not heeding opportunities to take off-ramps, to engage in dialogue. It's blowing through traditional stoplights. And it does look like it is moving towards some sort of provocation. So I would say generally, if you had to ask me, I am concerned that it's heading in that direction.
And Mr. Snyder, Special Representative Biegun was in South Korea back in August as well, and he was not able to meet with the North Koreans back then. And this time he made a public call to meet with the North Koreans. Does this show that the communication channel has broke down?
Well, there may be problems with the communication channel. It's hard to tell, but I think that it's unlikely usually that a bilateral dialogue between the U.S. and North Korea would necessarily be organized as part of a consultation trip to South Korea or Japan or China. It might be a target of opportunity, but I think that the South Korean media likes to play that up. Every time Biegun goes to South Korea, they're constantly saying, oh, well, maybe he'll go to the DMZ, especially after the Trump-Kim meeting on June 30th. But really, what's likely to happen is that the North Koreans will send a message through a bilateral channel, and there will be some kind of agreement to move forward on dialogue if the North Koreans are ready to do it.
So why did North Korea not meet with Mr. Biegun this time? Well,
I think they're on a trajectory towards provocation and escalation, and I think that I personally believe that it's part of the North Korean negotiating behavior profile. I think they feel they need a crisis in order to be able to take advantage. And in order to shape the environment so that maybe they can get more from the United States than from President Trump.
Mm-hmm. And Ambassador Lippert, so what do you think Christmas gift from North Korea will be? Do you expect measured provocation like medium-range ballistic missile or satellite, or going all out to ICBMs and nuclear tests?
Great question. You're asking me to predict the unpredictable, but what I would say, just to dovetail on Scott's comments, first, I do think it was important for Special Representative Biegun to show that the U.S. is continued to be committed to dialogue and negotiation, and I think that was a very important goal and objective that he accomplished during his trip there. On this potential provocation, to me, I've always felt that their smartest play is some sort of space launch. And why is that? One, It reminds the world of their red lines that they are creeping up against in terms of ICBM technology. Two, the Chinese and others tend to treat space launch a little differently, so it usually doesn't bring about the hard and severe repercussions in New York and elsewhere. And three, I think that they make a case internationally in and around space technology that tends to blunt the rest of the world, the non-UN permanent UN Security Council members. So for those reasons and a few others, I think that they are headed likely towards some sort of space launch. But that's a guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the other factor that usually influences North Koreans' decisions on this kind of thing is what is their immediate technical need. I agree that the space launch from a political perspective is probably a smart play for North Korea. But on the technical front, the key development, I think, is related to shifting to solid fuel and expanding the range of solid fuel rocketry. Mm-hmm. And so that's another area to watch as we anticipate what North Korea might do.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think Scott really hit the nail on the head in his answer, which is one, you are undertaking technical activity that advances a program, right? And those technical advances, when placed in the larger context of the nuclear missile programs, does pose threats to the U.S. and its allies in the region. I think the other thing politically, back on that point, it reminds the international community that the North has these tools at their disposal.
And Commander for Indo-PACOM Air Component Command said that he is expecting longer-range missiles, and that back in 2017, the U.S. sent stealth fighters and bombers to near North Korea. And what do you think of the current level of military alertness and the readiness?
I think that certainly the North Koreans have telegraphed that they want to do something. I'm sure the U.S. is preparing for a variety of options. The atmosphere is moving back toward a more confrontational atmosphere, and as we saw the intensification of testing in 2017, we also saw the U.S. bringing in strategic assets and doing things like that as signaling mechanisms to try to send the message to Kim Jong-un, please don't go down this road. It could have consequences for you. And so I think that we're kind of back in that mode. And in a way, the real challenge is that the Trump administration has not yet provided a ceiling for North Korean activity. And I think the North Koreans are not going to stop until they bump up against that ceiling. And so finding the right way to let the North Koreans know enough is enough is a very challenging decision point that the administration may face very soon.
Mm-hmm. And Ambassador Lippert, you were ambassador to South Korea from 2014 to 2017, and 2017 is the year when we've experienced the fire and fury time. So how would you compare the current military readiness to the military readiness back in 2017, and how close were we to having a war with North Korea?
Well, when I was ambassador, rewind the tape all the way to the bad old days of 2014, what I would say is that the big difference is tension around the demilitarized zone, right? And you remember there was a shooting episode, some sort of event up there in 2015 where, there just is a lot of conventional forces, military posture in close proximity. And that is something that is inherently, something that raises the possibility of a miscalculation. So that element is now reduced. And I would say where we are today is generally, I would say things tend to be more calm, tend to be more drawn back, tend to be a little more restrained. But again, I think that can be ramped up relatively quickly. We can head towards confrontation again on short notice. And I think your point earlier about the lines of communication staying open to, one, avoid all of this, mitigate this, and generally manage our way through this is very important as well.
Mm-hmm. Switching topics a little bit, China and Russia tabled a resolution at the UN Security Council and asking for easing of sanctions to North Korea, practically textiles, fisheries, all of the items. Is the intention of Russia and China to challenge the current US-led denuclearization process, or to just enhance their own leverage and create rooms for them to participate more?
Yes, both. I think the Chinese and the Russians, are exploiting a perception of a vacuum in U.S. leadership because, in fact, the U.S.-North Korea negotiations have stalled. They're offering alternatives. They're actually, in some ways, providing possibly an exit ramp for the North Koreans to fall back on an approach that might be an alternative way to get some sanctions easing. Really, from, I think, the U.S. perspective, in many respects, it is a spoiler role. And the danger, I think, of that kind of proposal is that it could give the North Koreans hope that they can actually get what they want, which is affirmation or acceptance of its status as a nuclear state.
Mm-hmm. Now, coming back to America, U.S. senators, Democratic senators, sent a letter to President Trump saying that the diplomacy with North Korea is on the brink of collapse. And what do you think is the current sentiment in Congress regarding diplomacy with North Korea?
Yeah, well, I think there's anxiety. In some ways, we're back to where we were at the beginning of the year, where Congress, I think, was concerned about what President Trump might do and sending signals of a desire to provide restraint and reassurance to the region. And now I think that after watching efforts to restore a dialogue process, the Congress is impatient and they feel like maximum pressure has not been upheld. And so I think that there is movement in Congress to try to look at ways of bolstering, basically giving the administration backbone on sanctions enforcement.
Mm-hmm. Then as we approach the year-end deadline, do you think there is any slimmer of chance for a breakthrough?
I think there's always a chance. And there's, I would say I wouldn't say it's a high probability, but you can always look at some of these actions as pre-negotiation posturing, right? And in the right context, you would say both sides are trying to gain leverage in front of some sort of negotiated settlement. Having said that, I tend to discount that to some degree in that there have been a lot of opportunities along the way, the last 6 months, year. That's point one. Point two is that I think that there have been a number of off-ramps offered that have been ignored as well. So again, I think it's very possible, but I tend to think that possibility is not a high percentage chance at this point in time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Last question, Mr. Snyder, how important would Kim Jong-un's New Year's speech be in setting the tone for diplomacy between Washington and Pyongyang in 2020?
I think that the New Year's speech is always useful in terms of setting the tone for where the North Koreans are going to go. I think it's important in particular, to Mark's point, that the North Koreans try to leave themselves some kind of exit ramp or space to reverse course because the course that they're headed on is potentially a very dangerous one and actually quite risky for the regime.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll leave our discussion here and now watch video for a second discussion.
As our president has said, we think that we need fair and equitable burden sharing with all of our allies around the world. And so we have been pursuing that.
해외에 주둔하고 있는 미군에 대한 방위비 또는 경비에 대한 분담은 저희가 받아들일 수 없다는 점을 명확히 하였습니다.
South Korea and the United States failed to narrow their gaps in defense cost-sharing negotiations. The two sides next meet in January, missing the year-end deadline when the current agreement expires. Now, Mr. Snyder, America's lead negotiator, Mr. DeHart, said that $5 billion is not the number that negotiators are focused in right now. Given the current rising tensions on the Korean Peninsula, is this the right time for America to push for exponential increase in South Korea's burden sharing?
Well, I mean, I feel that the entire Trump administration transactional approach to this issue of burden sharing is corrosive to the goal of trying to maintain and achieve security on the Korean Peninsula, primarily because the numbers in terms of targets or going in negotiating positions that the Trump administration has adopted are simply out of the ballpark. And we need to have a more realistic approach that is based on what can actually be achieved, and also one that reinforces the idea that we're on the same page, we have common values, and we have common objectives.
I think first principles of every one of these negotiations, which we have to do every 5 years, is the going in is to make the alliance stronger, to look for ways to improve the structures, and to generally use it as a moment, a 5-year waypoint to make sure that the alliance is keeping pace with the change that is around the peninsula, and inevitably. It's one of the most dynamic places in the world. So I think that's the first principle in which I think we need to ensure that we're focused on. The second point is that obviously we have this short-term issue of the burden sharing agreement. The good news is both sides, I think, recognize that the alliance is important. There is strong grassroots support for the alliance in both Korea and Washington. The Congress, and I would argue the National Assembly, also recognize the importance of the alliance.
Was SMA negotiations a difficult topic for you too as an ambassador in South Korea?
Well, remember, we're on a 5-year cycle, so I missed the cycle. I did happen to work in the Pentagon when we were renegotiating the SMA. And, the SMA is always a difficult issue. You get into this dollars and cents issues. It's tough. It's a scratchy negotiation. But I think in the end, in the last negotiation, which again, we missed deadlines, there was extensions, all of that. In the end, we came out stronger. And I think that's the overriding most important principle, a stronger, more adaptable, more modern alliance at the end of each 5-year period.
And Mr. Snyder, some South Koreans are directing their anger to Ambassador Harry Harris. Some college students broke into his residence and there are protests near his residence. What do you make of these developments?
It's not good for the relationship when issues in the relationship become politicized to that degree. And so some of that is a manifestation of the frustration. The other issue is that related to security and the security of these installations. And there it looks like the South Korean government may have a little bit more work to do. It's important not to be too relaxed on that issue, especially in a context where issues are becoming more politicized.
Do you believe anti-Americanism is on the rise?
Well, I think if we look at it from a historical perspective, actually it's declined a lot from the mid-2000s, the last phase when we really had some difficult issues related to emotions in the relationship. As Mark said, public opinion, public support for the alliance is very high on both sides, and I think the great risk is that the leadership squanders that reservoir of support unnecessarily by taking extreme positions on these issues rather than just focusing on the nuts and bolts and coming to a practical agreement, as Mark said, that strengthens the alliance.
And you had experience in military, so I want to ask you another military question. So the major difference between Washington and Seoul right now is whether for Seoul to share the burden for overseas operations and for the cost of transporting U.S. service members onto North Korea. How can the two sides narrow differences in that issue?
Yeah, I wouldn't be in a good position to provide tactical advice on a negotiation. But what I would say, though, is that I think if we go back to first principles and remind ourselves just how much the Korean society, government, people contribute to this alliance, right? And you sort of go through a list, and it's an amazing amount of contribution and sacrifice, right? Mandatory conscription, right? The world's largest overseas U.S. military base at a price of $10 billion, of which the Koreans pay 92 to 96% of, right? 4 to 8% defense spending increases per year. It's remarkable. So I think that point, I think, needs to be at the center of the discussions, reminding that this is a strong contributing ally.
And Ambassador, when you finished your term, Washington Post said that you are genuinely loved and you are the most beloved by South Koreans and you will be missed by South Koreans. What is your reaction to that?
It's great. I mean, it's just special. We had such a special time in South Korea. My kids were born there. Our kids were born there. We have they have Korean names. They speak Korean to this day. My son goes to Korean school. Well, you know, we had an unbelievably special time, a special relationship. I go back to Korea as much as I can. And what I would say is that we miss it every day. We miss it each and every day. And it's precisely why we're lucky we have a Korean emo. We speak Korean in the house. And so we get a little bit of Korea each and every day. But we miss it.
That's great. And Mr. Snyder, you also have very special ties with South Korea, right? How can we develop these very good personal relationships into the broader context of bilateral relations? Are we concerned about the current state of relations?
Well, there are a lot of things to be concerned about. I do think that the person-to-person relationship, I mean, basically in South Korea, relationships are everything. And I think that that also applies to the bilateral relationship. But we are at a moment, I think, in broader political terms, where we see on both sides that domestic politics is in some cases superseding foreign policy as a driver. And as a force for decision-making. And also we see new external challenges, both from North Korea and from China, that are going to test the alliance in new ways that we haven't seen before. Mm-hmm. And so the important thing is that we've lasted 65 years, but in order to keep going forward, we have to approach it with a certain sense of dynamism and adaptability, rather than just thinking of it as a fixed structure that is always going to serve our interests and be there regardless of changes that are occurring around the world.
Mm-hmm.
I think the key going forward is to make sure that we are broadening the alliance. When I was ambassador, we did a lot around what I call the new frontiers: cyber, space, energy, environment, global health, the fourth industrial revolution, and tying that all into the people-to-people constituencies that undergird each one of those functional issues. So I think the key going forward for next year, if I were providing advice and counsel, would be, let's get broader. Let's tap into some of these great areas of strength, expertise, dynamism that will position the alliance, as Scott said, well into the 21st century, bring support bases in, and again, to make sure that the alliance, while it has difficult issues, also has a number of areas of successful growth opportunities. And let's focus on that as well.
Well, we'll keep a close eye on South Korea and U.S. relations with high hopes, and we'll now move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a photo of Chairman Kim recently visiting the mausoleum commemorating the 8th anniversary of his late father's death. The embalmed bodies of Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung are displayed at the Kumsusan Palace of the Sun. This is a monument to the personality cult of North Korea's ruling family. Mr. Snyder?
Well, I have two reactions. One is that this is the moment for Pyongyangologists to look at who is accompanying Kim Jong-un, and what is remarkable is how much transition we have seen since the beginning of his rule. My second reaction is I had a chance to visit that mausoleum, and it is kind of chilling and amazing the extent to which that is a monument to the Kim family that every North Korean is kind of indoctrinated with. Mm-hmm. It is a very unique and kind of overwhelming experience that encompasses emotions and really plays to emotional commitment to the regime.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Ambassador?
I'm just always struck in that there's this Kim Jong. These scenes remind me of a point that I like to make, which is I think Kim Jong-un, despite being there due to his family name, the legacy of his family, he has inherited a model that is increasingly unsustainable in the 21st century. There are market forces, there are information flow forces, there are global economic forces all surrounding him. And all of these photos remind me that I do think that he realizes he has a dilemma. He does need to do something in terms of opening up, and he doesn't know how to make that move. And I think that is an important part of any negotiation, any diplomacy, any sanctions regime going forward.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Snyder, Ambassador Lippert, thank you for joining us. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.